Hello, this is Rebecca, Life with the Fritz, and today I am going to be reading the first chapter of a book that I feel is very important. I have recommended it over the course of the last 10 years to people that I know. I don't know how many people have read it, but I just feel the need to basically have an educational on this. The book is Preventing Violence by James Gilligan. And I'm going to read the inside of the cover just to give you a quick rundown on what it's about. And then I'm going to start reading the first chapter. And I guess I'll just give a little synopsis of how I feel about the first chapter, what I think about it at the end. And you'll have to excuse the background noise because I live on a busy street and I have children. It's very hot. I have the fan on. I'm sweaty. No better time than the present, though. It's something I've been wanting to do for a while. Okay. In this controversial and compassionate book, the distinguished American psychiatrist James Gilligan proposes a radically new way of thinking about violence and how to best prevent it. Violence is most often addressed in moral and legal terms. How evil is this action and how much punishment does it deserve? Unfortunately, this way of thinking, the basis for our legal and political institutions, does nothing to shed light on the causes of violence. So it's basically treating the symptom, not the cause. Violent criminals have been Gilligan's teachers, and he has been their student. Prisons are microcosms of the societies in which they exist, and examining them in detail, we can learn about society as a whole. Gilligan suggests treating violence as a public health problem. He advocates initiating radical social and economic change to attack the root causes of violence, focusing on those at increased risk of becoming violent, and dealing with those who are already violent as if they were in quarantine, rather than simply incarcerating them for reasons of punishment and revenge. The 20th century was steeped in violence. If we try to understand the violence of individuals, we may come to prevent the collective violence that threatens our future far more than all the individual crimes put together. Now, I think that this is an especially relevant book. Today is the 21st of June, and there's been rioting, there's been protesting all over the country in regards to the death of George Floyd. And in that respect, I think that this is the perfect time to start examining the whys and the root causes underneath the societal problems that we're experiencing right now. Okay. Introduction: two approaches to preventing violence. For the past 4 millennia, since the time of the first lawgivers, Hammurabi and Moses, Dracon and Solon, Plato and Aristotle, Cicero and Justinian, humanity has been engaged in a great social experiment, testing the hypothesis that we could prevent violence, or at least diminish its scale and intensity, by labeling it evil and criminal, ordering people not to engage in it, and then, when they commit acts of violence anyway, retaliating with more violence of our own, which we call punishment and justice. Now, 4,000 years is long enough to test any hypothesis. And the results of this experiment have been in for a long time. This means of attempting to prevent violence, which I will call the traditional moral and legal approach, far from solving the problem of violence or even diminishing the threat it poses to our continued survival, has in fact been followed by a continued escalation of the frequency and intensity of violence to the point that the century we have just survived has been the bloodiest in all human history, with more humans killing other humans than in all previous centuries combined. Worse yet, we have now achieved, through a deliberate effort, the technological ability to kill everyone on Earth, thus becoming the first species in evolutionary history to be in danger of bringing about its own extinction, unless we can increase our ability to prevent violence far more effectively than we have for the past 4,000 years. Given that the approach used for the past 4 millennia has been such a total failure, indeed has been so counterproductive, resulting in more rather than less violence, the beginning of a new millennium would seem to be an auspicious moment to consider replacing that ancient strategy with a radically new and different one. Clearly, you can tell that this was written around 2000. That is why I welcome the invitation to contribute to these series of books on the major challenges and opportunities, the major problems and most promising solutions that we can anticipate during the coming millennium, and to bring to bear on the most important problem a perspective derived from the human sciences. Many judges and legal scholars, and even some legislators, agree that there is a need to question many of the law's traditional assumptions and practices, and are working to bring the criminal justice system into the 21st century. For example, there are many experiments with attempts to replace retributive with restorative justice, and to develop new concepts such as therapeutic jurisprudence, alternative sentencing schemes, drug courts, and so on, as I'll discuss at greater length in Chapter 7. On a larger scale, many national governments and even international bodies like the United Nations and the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague are trying to discover or invent new bases for negotiating an end to collective violence in all its forms: genocide, war crimes, totalitarianism, racial discrimination, ethnic cleansing, and so on, for repairing the physical and psychological trauma those forms of violence leave in their wake, and for preventing new outbreaks of them through truth and reconciliation commissions, selective amnesty policies, peacekeeping missions, abandonment of traditional notions of national sovereignty, and so on. They are engaging in these social and legal experiments in the only way that we have ever been able to develop successful new strategies for living together, namely, slowly, painfully, controversially, by trial and error, and in an atmosphere of humility and open debate rather than of vengeance and self-righteousness. In other words, the issue I'm raising here is not a debate between law and psychiatry, as much as a debate that is going on within the law itself, which, to its credit, has given it more attention than most psychiatrists have, with many judges, law schools, and schools of government and public policy welcoming contributions from several different disciplines. And here I'll stop to say that crimes followed a pendulum, or how to handle crime has followed a pendulum pattern, where it's tough on crime, then it's soft on crime, tough on crime, soft on crime, going back and forth, depending on how long the cycle is and all that kind of stuff. Sorry. Many of the judges, attorneys, government officials, legislators, law enforcement professionals, and prison administrators with whom I have worked over the past 30 years are clearly aware of the massive shortcomings and failures of our traditional ways of attempting to cope with the dangers to which the human propensity for violence exposes us all. The only question is, with what can we replace them? That is what I will try to outline in what follows. In this short book, I will make no attempt to provide a comprehensive survey of the many specific community initiatives proposed for preventing violence. Excellent compendia and summaries are already available. They can also be found increasingly on the internet. For example, the Center in Colorado for the Study and Prevention of Violence at the University of Colorado Boulder has identified 10 highly effective violence prevention programs sufficient to provide a nucleus for a national violence prevention initiative and 17 promising programs. Nor have I attempted to write a how-to or a cookbook approach summarizing step-by-step recipes for putting together any one program. I have two worries about much of what passes for violence prevention in the literature on this subject, apart from such thoughtful treatments as those referred to above. The first is that we are in danger of forgetting that when we talk about preventing violence, we are not talking about something that can be solved with gimmicks. We are not talking about techniques. We are talking about whether and how we and other human beings can learn to live with each other and even to want to live with each other. And I mean live as opposed to die, for that is the only other choice where violence is concerned. But that is too profound a question to be answered by anything other than a radical rethinking of the most basic principles on which our social life is based. We are in danger of not seeing the forest, or more to the point, of not noticing that the forest as a whole is being destroyed as we talk, if we get distracted by examining 1,000 different little trees. As David Downs has written in Crime, 1995, some social crime prevention projects have been mounted, but despite some successes, they tend to be too localized, short-term, and underfunded to make a lasting impact. Tony Blair's formulation, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, is greatly to be preferred, but rests on the premise that we can sort out the confusion about what those causes are and then agree on how to tackle them. Meanwhile, being tough on crime, the traditional moral and legal approach, which is more expensive and, if anything, exacerbates the problem, takes priority by default. You cannot stop a hemorrhage with Band-Aids, however many you apply. For a hemorrhage, you need major surgery. And this is why people talk about abolishment instead of reform, by the way. And I worry that as we fritter away our time and energies debating the minutiae of small-scale, do-it-yourself type community initiatives, the patient will bleed to death. Naturally, those who do not want major change would prefer to restrict the conversation to timid, half-hearted preventative efforts. They maintain that we cannot afford to do what preventing violence will require, or that the voters who in the meantime are not being educated will not support it, so that this whole argument becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Meanwhile, no expense or cruelty is spared in the effort to inflict as much pain as possible on those whom we use as scapegoats for our own massive failure to create a real family of humankind, namely a viable social and economic system. As the authors of one of the best and most comprehensive evaluations of violence prevention programs put it, communities are the central institution for crime prevention, the stage on which all other institutions perform. Families, schools, labor markets, retail establishments, police, and corrections must confront the consequences of community life. Much of the success or failure of these other institutions is affected by the community context in which they operate. Our nation's ability to prevent serious violent crime may depend heavily on our ability to help reshape community life. The causes correlated with serious crime are basic and interconnected, while the programs are superficial and piecemeal. For most of this century, community crime prevention programs have failed to tackle the governmental policies and market forces that fuel inner-city violence. Ironically, a central tenet of community prevention programs has been the empowerment of local community leaders to design and implement their own crime prevention strategies. This philosophy may amount to throwing people overboard and then letting them design their own life preserver. The scientific literature shows that the policies and market forces causing criminogenic community structures and cultures are beyond the control of neighborhood residents, and that empowerment does not include the power to change those policies. It is one thing, for example, for tenants to manage the security guards in a public housing project. It is another thing entirely to let tenants design a new public housing policy and determine where in a metropolitan area households with public housing support will live. Thus, the major causes of community crime problems are like handcuffs, locking a community into a high crime rate. The most frequently evaluated community-based crime prevention programs do not attempt to break those handcuffs. Rather, they operate inside those constraints, attempting small wins within the limited range of risk factors they can manipulate. But until the handcuffs of race-based politics themselves are unlocked, systematic racism, many analysts expect relatively few major improvements from programs addressing only the symptoms of those constraints. Or, to paraphrase Jeremiah, our false prophets cry, community, community, but we have no community. Our first task then, before we can even begin to think about preventing violence, is to learn how to create something that would actually be a community. That is why I've concentrated in this book on developing a new way of thinking about preventing violence, rather than simply providing recipes as to how to replicate one program or another that's been tried somewhere already. The gift of a fish only feeds us for a day, and we really need to learn how to fish. So instead of limiting myself to the facts of what people have done so far, I will attempt to see if we can discover some basic principles underlying the causes and prevention of violence so that we will all be in a better position to originate new ideas and approaches and to evaluate those that have already been proposed or implemented by others, as well as those that will only exist in the future. One more century in which the human capacity to commit individual murders and other crimes, and also mass murder, genocide, and war crimes increases as explosively as it did during the past century, and we may not survive for as long as another millennium. Either we will learn to end violence as a means of resolving disputes and pursuing goals during the coming century, or it will end us. So very true. The old approach, the traditional moral and legal approach, has not only failed to solve the problem, it has actually made it worse. Its failure is so total that the question of whether or not we should continue it is no longer even debatable. The moral and legal approach is not merely bankrupt theoretically, it is positively dangerous in practical terms. Why has the traditional approach been such a total failure? There are many reasons, of which I will mention two. Is the criminal law based on a huge mistake? The first reason is that we cannot learn what causes violence and how we could prevent it as long as we are thinking in the traditional moral and legal terms. The only questions that this way of thinking can ask take the form: how evil or heroic was this particular act of violence, and how much punishment or reward does the person who did it deserve? But even if it were possible to gain the knowledge that would be necessary to answer these questions, which it is not, answers would still not help us in the least to understand either what causes violence or how we could prevent it. These are empirical, not moral questions. It is only by approaching violence from the point of view of empirical disciplines as a problem in public health and preventative medicine, including social and preventative psychiatry and psychology, that we can acquire knowledge as to the causes and prevention of violence by engaging in clinical, experimental, and epidemiological research on violent and non-violent behavior, the people who behave in those ways, and the circumstances under which they do so. I have devoted much of my professional life to doing exactly that, and this book about preventing violence, like its predecessor on the causes of violence, Gilligan, Violence, 1996, will consist of summarizing for you what I saw and heard in the course of more than 30 years of participating in, directing, and evaluating violence prevention programs with the most violent people that our society produces. In order to conduct this research, I used my laboratory, so to speak, one institution in our society which contains, by deliberate purpose, a pure culture of violence, namely the prison. Prisons are intended, after all, as the receptacles in which we isolate those individuals, mostly men, whom we have identified as the most extremely and unacceptably violent. My friends and colleagues often ask me why I chose to work in such terrible places as prisons and the prison mental hospital, and with patients who are dangerous and with whom it is hard to sympathize, when I already had a comfortable private practice and a teaching position at the Harvard Medical School. I would answer by paraphrasing the bank robber Willie Sutton, who replied when asked why he robbed banks, because that's where the money is. I worked in the prisons because that's where the violence is. It's where the violent people are. And that was what I was interested in and wanted to understand better. I do not know how one could learn why people become violent or what we can do to prevent violence, except by working on those problems with violent people. I can think of no better laboratory in which to investigate those subjects and in which to observe at first hand, from the inside, literally, the whole apparatus of crime and punishment in the criminal justice system. So when I contrast the traditional moral and legal way of thinking with the approach of public health and preventative medicine, I am not speculating or speaking as a philosopher engaging in abstract theorizing. This is an intensely practical and down-to-earth difference with real consequences for real people, with which I was confronted on a daily basis for many years. For example, I have testified in scores of courtroom trials of people charged with murder and other violent crimes as an expert witness whose job was to perform psychiatric evaluations of the defendants. I could not have had a more intensive exposure to the differences in the kinds of questions that are asked by the legal system when we approach violence as a moral and legal problem. For example, does this defendant have an evil mind, a mens rea? The moral value judgment that is a precondition for finding of legal guilt, versus the kinds of questions we are prompted to ask when we think of violence as a problem in public health and preventative medicine. For example, what led this man to commit such a violent act? And or what interaction of biological, psychological, and social forces caused him to harm someone, and what can we do to decrease the likelihood that he and others will behave that way in the future? There were times in the courtrooms and prisons in which I did my work when I felt as though I had somehow been transported by mistake back into the Middle Ages, when people still thought that evil, like its mythical embodiment and namesake, the devil, was an objective thing that actually existed independently of our subjective feelings and thoughts rather than a word we